Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. In today's video we have an excellent presentation on tertiary progressions by astrologers Dr. Jens Art and Cameron Cassidy. And lastly, if you wish to view our current class, workshop and webinar offerings, please visit KeplerCollege.org. And without further ado, let's get into the video.
All right, so I'm going to introduce Jen first. Dr. Jens Art is an author, publisher, and teacher of cultural astronomy and astrology. From 2017 to 2022, she was an honorary research fellow at the Sophia Center for the Study of Cosmology and Culture at the University of Wales Trinity St. David. She is an Emerita trustee of KeplerCollege and now serves on the board of directors for the International Society for Astrological Research, also known as ISAR. Dr. Zart founded the Celestial Arts Education Library in 2021 and curates over 10,000 volumes of astrological books, journals, and newsletters. You can find her at the Cayley Institute and teaching at Kepler College. I'd also like to introduce Cameron Cassidy. Cameron is an astrologer, yoga teacher, and linguophile from Massachusetts. He synthesizes his abilities as a translator, an artist, and student of Hermetic and yogic sciences to bring ancient methods of healing to people of the modern world. He is the editor for the Cayley Institute's quarterly journal, the Cayley Review. He co-hosts the Mercurianians podcast, and he teaches online classes through his website. He's out of Salem, Massachusetts, where he co-runs a local astrology group, and you can find him at omegaastrology.com. And now I can hand it over to the two of you. Enjoy the presentation.
Thank you so much for that awesome introduction. It's an honor to be back. Welcome everybody from all over the world. It's so awesome to have such a large group of people here and to get to speak about this pretty awesome technique called tertiary progressions. Cam, do you want to kick off the screen share?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, this is super exciting for Jen and I. This is something that we've been collaborating over and just talking about this technique for several years at this point and kind of nerding about it. So we're super grateful and yeah, privileged to be able to teach this class this upcoming summer on advanced progressions and specifically today to talk to you all about tertiary progressions. So yeah, welcome to Matter and Soul. So hey everyone, we're Cam and Jen. And as mentioned already, we just had our wonderful introductions. Thank you again. We're going to be leading together a course this summer on advanced progressions. It's 5 weeks long. We're going to be getting into tertiary, minor, and converse directions. And we'll also be talking about how to apply the use of fixed stars and the lunar mansions into your progressional techniques. So if you're interested in any of that, definitely, yeah, take a look. So many of you, I think we can all assume or maybe hope have heard about the timing technique of secondary progressions or secondaries, which essentially equate 1 day of transits to 1 year of life. So we can kind of make all of these different analogs of planetary cycles in that sense. And one fundamental one we're going to keep exploring today is actually through the lunar cycle. So we know that a lunar cycle takes around 27 to 28 days. And in that time, that will map actually onto 27 or 28 years of our life through this secondary progression. So this is just one scale of many different ones. And it's a little more slow moving than the other ones that we're going to look at, particularly today with tertiaries. And it's actually as old as Vedi's balance. He talks about using a day for a year calculation using an ephemeris from almost 2,000 years ago. So this is a pretty old method, but the tertiaries are more relatively new. Oops. Okay. So, Jen?
So if you think about the rotation of the Earth on its own axis, everybody just kind of sink into your chair and think about your body from the top of your head down to the bottom of your spine. And the Earth is rotating on its own axis. And that motion, when it completes, is a day. And we mark that with sunrise to sunrise in general, right? And then the Earth also has a secondary motion around going around the sun. We see that as the sun going around us as sunrise, sunset, etc. But really, it's the Earth moving around the sun in an ellipsis. So that's the general analogy and the motion of a secondary progression, is that we're equating the revolution of the Earth on its own axis, or the rotation of the Earth on its own axis, with the revolution of the Earth around the sun, right? You can imagine that fairly simply. And we just had the summer solstice, and so we're at one of those apex points of our year. And this is something that's kind of built into our calendar. But we're also very lunar, and months, and we're at this other magical point in our world where this full moon specifically that we just had a few days ago, yesterday I think it was, we have a maximum lunar standstill, right? Which is another way that we're in relationship with our moon. And prehistoric cultures used to build monuments with stones, megalithic monuments, to mark out this solely lunar relationship. In the mid-1950s, an astrologer named E.H. Troinsky had this iteration of this analogy of the Earth rotating on its own axis to it rotating around the sun. And he makes this notification in his mind of, well, the moon orbiting on its own axis is equivalent to a tropical month. So when we're thinking about what the tertiaries are as a day of life equals a month of life, it's actually a lunar day, because when the moon orbits the Earth, it's rotating on its axis so slowly. This is why we can't see the dark side of the moon. So this astronomical observation translated into a technique called tertiary progressions, because of the time scale. Instead of 1 day equals 1 year, it's 1 day equals 1 month, and it's oriented towards the moon.
Yeah, exactly. And so this method being more recently introduced by Troinsky is not as widespread in its use. Hopefully we're changing that, and vectors for change for that, because we'll show you all today just how important and powerful it really is. And so, like Jen said, we're now, instead of doing day to year, we're going to be looking at 1 day of transits applying to 1 lived month of your life. So instead of asking that question of like, how many years old are you? And then moving through the ephemeris to count how many days down, we have to ask the question, how many months old are you? And we count that many days down through the ephemeris. And we'll get more into the specifics of how what we mean by month when we say that. But so essentially, 12 days of transiting planetary motion will map out to 1 year of life, because in 1 year we have 12 months, and 1 month will be 1 day. So instead of just 1 day to 1 year, this technique is actually 12 days to 1 year, which is about 12 times faster than the secondary progression. So that's what I was saying before about how it's a little slower, the secondaries, than these other techniques. Now, the other major quality here is that this progression is inherently lunar, since we're equating the Earth's relationship directly with the moon's relationship. So this is a nice contrast to the solar quality of the secondary progressions, which equate the Earth-Sun relationship with that day to year. And so here's another little page just about Troinsky here. Like you said, Jen, he wrote this amazing book back in 1954. Perhaps it had been tested and theorized about, or much earlier in history. Perhaps.
In fact, actually, he was the first one, and Rob Hand has written about this. So we have confirmation that tertiaries did get invented in the 20th century, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, no, it's amazing because this technology is so powerful, really. And this is also a testament to the astrology of the 20th century, which really by no means was substandard. There was a lot of amazing astrology going on, especially in the early and mid 20th century. They were all creating new innovative techniques and approaches, especially for timing techniques, using all these different progressional scales and symbolic arc measures and solar, lunar, and lunar returns, kinetic returns. So there's all this really exciting stuff going on. So this is another hallmark from that really exciting period of development.
Yeah, and they were really testing, in their mind, they knew there was a gap in the transmission, and they were saying, just because it's old doesn't mean that we need to follow it blindly. Let's do research. Let's test it and see if it works now for where we are now. And that led to a lot of mathematical innovation, and also, even at the turn of the 1900s, they didn't know what was beyond Neptune. Pluto didn't get discovered for 30 years. So you see in culture, there's a lot of fantasies about things beyond Neptune. And you saw the Lori talked about the Uranian astrology group. Uranian astrology was a way of imagining what's beyond Neptune and trying to interpolate factors that were beyond that orbit. And so we've all grown up in a world where we have these high-powered telescopes and we can see and measure almost exactly everything. But that wasn't really true in the early 20th century. There was different beginnings of learning the astronomy and sort of fine-tuning the ability to measure certain things and to actually know what was beyond Neptune, for example. So the astrology there is actually rich in its iterations of what we know, blending the technical science with the qualitative science and testing those traditional methods that now we're sort of, since 1993, we've been obsessed with reviving a tradition, but it masks that revival masks over some of the cool innovations being made in the 20th century that were actually relying on classical sources. It's just not talked about a lot. So this is coming from that lineage.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why part of what was really exciting for us when we were talking about this, because, there's been all this hype about Time Lords and traditional techniques for several years now, but I think there's also going to be a coming resurgence of a lot of this material that's just been under-discussed and under-circulated. But I was so grateful to, and am continually so grateful to be able to access so many of the materials at the Cayley Institute and at the library, because there is just a host of astrologers that were using this and other progressional scales like primary directions, secondary, tertiaries, and also the minor progression or quaternary progression, which actually equates the moon's motion to the sun's, which is 1 month to 1 year, which we won't talk about today.
I just want to speak to Chloe's comment in the chat. If there is a technique like that in Yotish, that's amazing to hear. That was not Troinsky's lineage with it, but in people who have, like different people who've tested symbolic directions, the tertiary method that he comes up with definitely wins. And there are other methods people tried that do not actually win. And so I think that there's, and when I say win, I mean like work. And so he was striking upon some kind of thing about the way celestial math works that worked. And if that was also happening in another lineage, that's amazing, but it wasn't a direct transmission.
Yeah. Now, Robert Blaschke in the 1990s published a seminal text on these progressional scales called Progressions, which is also going to be recently republished by Revelor Press. Very, very, very exciting. So stay tuned for that publication coming out very soon as well. And he basically outlined these three major relationships between the Earth, the Sun, and the Moon, just as we've been talking about them all. So the Earth-Sun we know is the secondary progression, the Earth-Moon is the tertiary, and the one I just kind of briefly introduced there, the month to year, is that Moon-Sun or minor relationship. And like we've said, the tertiaries relate the earthly to the lunar. And as we've also been reiterating, this method was proven very quickly to be so effective and useful that so many people actually started adopting them once they had started testing it. I guarantee all of you guys, if you start testing out this technique, you will not drop it from your toolbox because it's so excellent. And so it's been continued to be used and written about since Troinsky's introduction by amazing astrologers like Davison, Jones, Charles Jane, amazing, Martin Freeman, Svensson, Hauck, Blaschke, Till, Adler, and so many more people. Now, this is going to segue us to a discussion that is important about actually how long is 1 day or 1 month. This is a really critical question because when we're in the game of, looking to refine our timing techniques, which is the whole genesis of creating a tertiary progression in addition to a secondary anyway, we need to really be clear about how we're defining a day and a month, and we shouldn't just take that for granted, actually. So we need to measure what length of time actually exclusively defines 1 day or an Earth unit, so to say, and the length of 1 month or 1 lunar unit. So this begins our quest for precision. Now, this is where I'll also introduce this idea of a corridor, because in astrology, as I'm sure you're all aware, there's this kind of non-binary nature to measurement where things can apply, kind of in a range, but also really specifically. Things can be done continuously or really discretely, and they're kind of both simultaneously true. And it's really an extension of the quantum reality of our cosmos, where when scientists are measuring these tiny elementary particles, they can measure its general location through a wave function model, which you actually see in the image on the right here. And so until its exact position is measured, we know it's going to be in this range of time. And then it's exactly measured, and the wave function of its probable area is collapsed into one area. And so astrological measurement works the same way, where we can refine our precision over time, and it's going to narrow that wave function down until that event happens or manifests in someone's life. And that like collapses the wave function, so to say. So we're talking about this quest for accuracy, right? But really, it doesn't restrict events to occur exactly then, though it often does. It more often highlights the more likely midpoint in time that the event occurs in. So I hope that makes sense. There's an analogy I have here where when you're studying trigonometry, there's this question of how do we find the center of a triangle? It's actually a really important question when you're studying trigonometry. And the reality is there's many different ways to do it, and they're all right at the same time. So this is a diagram here that shows the different ways geometers can calculate where the center of a triangle is, and that depends on how you define which center you want to look at. Now, the analogy I want to highlight is that amidst all of those different centers, there exists this beautiful property with triangles where you can actually draw a straight line through those 4 critical centers of a triangle, and it's called an Euler line. And so astrological prediction works the same way, where nature shows how there's still a perfect correlation between the various and simultaneously true ways of looking at something. So this is what we're looking for. We want to be able to refine our precision, but at the same time, be able to zoom out and see the different ways of looking at something as they're all true.
Yep, we're looking for this triangle.
Exactly.
Just kidding, it's not that.
So how do we define the precise times? So a day, how do we measure a day? There's many ways to do it. Jen, you already talked about this, right? The rotation of our Earth.
Yes.
And this question of how can we measure that with reference to, our observation? And so there's 2 ways. There's the sidereal day and a solar day. So the sidereal day is actually an exact 360-degree rotation of the Earth. So it's just actually less than 24 hours. So unlike the solar day, which measures the transit of the sun from the MC back to the MC, because the sun moves 1 degree, it's just over that 360 degrees, and it's actually 361 degrees. And so astrologers around this time in the early to mid 20th century discovered that with this correction to actually using the sidereal day and not the solar day, we can actually increase the accuracy of the progressions. And this is called the bija correction. And this is really important. So when we measure the sidereal day, this was actually introduced by lots of astrologers in the Western Sidereal Astrology School and others, so Fagan and Firebrace and Jondrell. And so lots of astrologers use the solar day still. Lots of programs are still using that. But I really will encourage everyone to start looking into the bija correction, which uses the sidereal day. Because what happens is for secondaries, your events are going to be off by 1 day every year. So after about 50 years, the calculated event of whatever secondary progressed aspect you're looking at, moon opposite Saturn, after you're 50 years old, will be calculated 50 days too early. So this correction is important. So again, it's more precise, but it's still this corridor of time. So I'll also just recommend that everyone, if you want to learn more about the bija correction and progressions, watch the webinar posted recently by Dr. Ronald Tiggle on the Kepler channel on YouTube, The Promise of Fractal Progressions. He talks about this in much more extensive and clear detail. And there's also other ways to measure a day through the motion of the heavenly bodies. So we can talk about the moon's daily motion through one lunar mansion, which is going to be an aspect that we'll develop a lot further in discussing in our course. Or we can discuss the sun moving through 1 degree. And those units of space can also define the time. And this is how we actually start to understand how secondaries relate to tertiaries. So with the secondary motion, the moon will move through 1 day of motion in a year, or 1 mansion, and the sun moves 1 degree. So over 30 years, the moon does the full circuit, all the mansions. And because the sun does 1 degree in 1 day or 1 year, the sun does 30 degrees in 30 years. Now with the tertiary, the moon moves 1 lunar mansion a month, and the sun moves 1 degree a month. So those are the same. It's just changing that plays out in 1 year or 1 month from secondary to tertiary. And likewise, in 30 months, you'll have a full lunar circuit through all the mansions and the sun through 1 sign or 30 degrees. Now, you may notice a connection here, and that's the critical link. And that's where the secondary progressed moon actually moves as fast as the tertiary progressed sun, because they will both move through 1 sign in 2.5 years or 30 months. Does that make sense to everyone? It's sort of hard to see that just written on here, but the more you play with it or count with it and look at an ephemeris, that key is really so clear and fundamental.
The secondary progressed moon moves as fast as the tertiary progressed sun. Lori.
Someone was just asking what a lunar mansion is. Is that important for them to understand for your presentation?
We won't discuss them in depth at all today. The mansion is essentially a measurement of the zodiac that tracks exactly how far the moon moves in 1 day. So it was an ancient way of just saying, like, oh, what day is it? Because today the moon is in a new mansion. So there's 27 or 28, because that's just about how long it takes in days for the moon to move around the circle of the zodiac.
And many world cultures developed systems of lunar mansions.
Yeah. Yeah.
You might also know them as nakshatras.
Yes, exactly. And in the month, Jen?
So a month is measured by the moon. And we are going to be looking at a sidereal lunar month, right? So it's the moon returning to the same position relative to the stars. If you think about a synodic month, we have the timescale of 29.5, which, if you know about secondary progressions, is this secondary progressed lunation, it's not your lunar return because that happens at 27.4, but 29.5 is that the Earth is still moving on the course of this month. Those 2 degrees add up for the lunation between new moon to new moon. The Earth still moves. So we're perceiving the moon's relationship to the sun when we're looking at the synod. That's bringing the sun into the picture, and we don't want to do that for this. We want to keep the moon in her own domain and leave the sun out of it for now. And so the sidereal lunar month is the moon moving in relationship to its own self, the zodiac position relative to the stars, not necessarily to what her relationship with the sun is going to be. So we don't say new moon to new moon. We're just saying, is the moon at 8 Aries? Oh, when is it going to be at 8 Aries again, right? Do you want to go through these? There's many ways to measure a month, actually, more than you might even know. So Cam, take it over.
Yeah, so like with these months, there's a lot of different ways they are measured. And it is important to know, because the successive recurrence of, for example, the draconic and the anomalistic and the sidereal month is how you measure when an eclipse recurs, because it's the same alignment of the sun and the moon and the nodes. So these other ones are important. You don't need to know them for this, but these are other ways you can measure a month. So on the tropical zodiac, you can measure the moon's return to the equinoctial point. You could measure a draconic month, which is from the moon's node to the moon's node, which is slightly shorter because those nodes are ever moving backwards a little bit. Then there's the anomalistic month, which is where she returns to the apogee point, or from the perigee to the perigee. So basically where she's in proximity to the Earth. So in the course of the month, her orbit is a little bit like an ellipse. So sometimes she appears a little further, sometimes she's a little closer. We can measure it that way too. Then there's also a solar month, which is just an exact even 12th, of the annual year, or a calendric month, which is kind of, it's probably the most absurd way to think about doing it. But nevertheless, Cherinsky actually outlined these 7 ways to look at how we actually calculate a month. And we are settling on the idea that, yeah, it has to be the sidereal lunar month. It's the only measurement that purely involves the moon. Everything else involves something else. So,
And before we go on, though, I just wanted to also
yeah.
emphasize that we have to imagine the moon is all rotating on her own axis, and that is the exact tropical relationship. And that's an important thing to really lean into and ingest and appreciate about our moon, because it is another reason why this specific measurement works so well. If we're creating an analogy of the Earth rotating on its own axis, so is the moon, and it takes a month for the moon's day on our Earth time. So I think that's really cool.
Yeah, exactly. So secondaries and tertiaries, as we've already described that connection between them, where the secondary progressed moon does a sign in 2.5 years, which is the same amount of time that the tertiary sun does a sign, there's this link. There's a connection between them, because the same days of transits that follow your birth will occur in those years way down the road by secondaries, but they'll happen much sooner in the tertiaries because they move faster. So do you want to talk a little more about this time link?
So one thing you can do with people, if you're somebody who sees clients repeatedly, and this is coming partially from Blaschke's work with his client base, is that, he's not with us anymore, but when he was seeing people, he would say, if you have an upcoming secondary progressed perfection, like let's say Saturn's going to conjoin Mars, you would have seen that happen as a youth, and you can link back to what happened when you were smaller on the tertiary level to understand how that's going to play out on the secondary level. And these things are also extra emphasized when they recur with transits happening at that exact same time. So with the tertiary time scale, you have a lot of information. And you'll see that, and this goes to CEO Carter, our other astrological ancestor, that when you, in the triangle that Cam showed you, when all of these different testimonies stack on top of each other and they have the similar signatures of whichever planets are involved, you can see that that's going to be something that's pretty unavoidable. So if you're forecasting, you can look to the tertiary progressions to see how the secondary progressions might play out and help someone write the narrative of their life. Because something that happened kind of as an anomaly as a child or even as a young adult might not have made sense then. And then suddenly with the upcoming secondary perfection of that, then you can see, oh, this does link to that. And it helps you put yourself kind of on the map in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And so just as an example here, say there's an aspect happening 45 days after you were born. Okay, so by secondary progression, we know that's going to happen at age 45. But like you said and described, this is linked to something in your consciousness from when you were much younger and experienced it through the tertiary progression at 45 months old, which would happen just before your age 4 at about 48 months. Now, I'll also just highlight, though, that's 48 calendar months to assume. And remember, we're counting actually sidereal lunar months, which is answering the question, how many lunar returns have you had? That's really what we actually are asking ourselves here, right? So in summary, it becomes very simple to see that the true equation of a tertiary progression needs to equate one sidereal day, so a pure 360 of the Earth, with a sidereal lunar month, a pure 360 of the moon's orbit. So again, we have to ask how many sidereal lunar returns you've had and equate the same amount with sidereal days, or those full rotations of the Earth after you were born. Now, a lifetime of secondaries would average about 82 days after you were born. And so what's going to happen is that's going to be at the time of 3 secondary progressed lunar returns. And this will actually fully play out around the first 4.5 years of life. So with that holographic time link, that period of time of your whole lifetime is experienced just in your childhood, almost before you're 5. Mm-hmm. So those childhood years, this is something Blaschke talks a lot about, is how those critical years of childhood development map out into the rest of the psyche for the rest of the lifetime. And we want to really highlight the moon today. There's so many approaches to looking at the tertiary progressions. We can talk about literally every planetary factor, but we're just going to talk about the moon right now. because it's built around the moon. So do you want to talk a little bit about how that's interpreted here?
So if you think about the ability of a small person under the age of 6 to determine their life circumstances, it's not very there at all, if at all, right? So you're kind of at the mercy of your caretakers, parents, wherever they take you, whatever you're being exposed to. And so you experience emotions as your place of control. It's a very Saturn, even Saturn square kind of thing, right? And so this tertiary progression is really responding to our emotional reality and the sort of sensitivities that we have as bodies on this planet, right? It's not the matter of the earth per se, but it's our soul, and the sun is related to spirit in Blaschke's conception. And so this gives us a sense of our relationship to our development in terms of our emotional realities and how we are feeling a response to our environment. And, we might not be in control of it, but we're definitely, it's the moon is pointing towards those sensitivities and proclivities that we have. And so it's like, again, with that idea of doing client work and helping someone understand on a secondary level of your spirit and purpose, and I can do things when I'm 45. And then you remind them of like, well, what happened when you were 4.5? And you're like, oh, my parents had moved us from my favorite childhood home to this place I didn't like. And it's like, okay, well, you couldn't control that, but you had an emotional ability to relate to it and to experience it through that vector. So
Yeah. So it's the evolving emotional and psychic intelligence. It's where people feel the concern for their everyday life. It's not like there's an immediate necessary action happening there, but you feel tethered and tugged to this place energetically or emotionally. So it's where you feel like you need to be active or doing something, or where you're required to feel some kind of emotional response to your environment. Blaschke says that it defines the experiences of the emotional or astral body because that moon-earth quality is linking soul into matter. So it's that pure soul experiencing the physical reality, and that's when there's this like emotional response of how do I feel about that? What is my soul or my consciousness, experiencing while it's getting immersed into this manifested reality?
mm-hmm.
And that extension of the moon's motion maps really nicely through the progressed moon phase, which, if you have worked with secondary progressions, is one of the first techniques that's really explored, is looking at how that moon phase and its motion through the course of the month in relationship to the sun maps onto those 28, 29-year-long periods of your life. And we're going to do that here and just shrink it down because they happen 12 times in the course of one secondary progressed lunation cycle.
So if you're impatient, this is totally your progression style, because if I have like a client who has a balsamic phase moon and I'm like, yeah, it's going to be 3 years, and they're like, get me out of here. The good news is on the tertiary progressed level, there's relief because there's not just this static kind of, oh my gosh, you're in a dark moon for 3 whole years. It's more like there's going to be ups and downs inside of that period of secondary darkness.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So we're mapping that lunar cycle onto about 27 to 30 months of life, of our life moving through our age. So it's just about 2.5 years. So the moon, like I said, is about in one sign in the tertiary progression for 2.5 months, as opposed to secondary, where it's 2.5 years. So think about the flavor of experiencing a new moon sign every 2.5 months. That's what we're all doing on that tertiary level. So that means every 2.5 years, it's coming back to its natal position in the tertiary progression. And again, in the same time window, it will conjoin and oppose the sun in 2 houses in the natal chart. So this is really the crux of our approach that we're going to share in the presentation, with watching the new and full moons that happen every 2.5 years through the signs and through the houses. And then considering that in 30 years, you'll have 24 lunations. There will be a new and full moon in all 12 signs and all 12 houses over the course that your secondary moon does 1 full cycle. Yeah. So again, this is showing how the consciousness is maturing and waning itself through the chart. So every 2.5 years, a new moon is hitting a successive house, just as on the other side, a full moon is lighting up and completing off some storyline in the successive houses there. There's also eclipses that we want to take note of. Do you want to talk about that, Jen?
Well, the eclipses are going to be more impactful, aren't they, Cam? And it's a sort of
Yes.
underscoring, if you're born at the bendings, you might not get anywhere near a secondary progressed eclipse, but in the tertiaries, everybody gets eclipses. In tertiaries, everybody gets a lot of astrology because it covers almost 3 to 4 years of time. And so, if you're feeling left out because you're not going to get a station of a certain outer planet, on the tertiary level, congratulations, now you've got one. So,
You got many.
but yeah, exactly. And then, so these eclipses are, just what you would read in any other time scale is like, it's a galvanizing point, and you can read in the course of someone's lifetime. It might not be apparent on the secondary level or even on a transit level, but a tertiary eclipse is going to manifest in some impactful time in someone's life. And so you can see where you are on that roller coaster, in addition to the full and new moons that are taking place. Like the eclipses are going to be underscoring a particular thing that might not be explained by any other time scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really comfy time scale, really, having a new moon every 2.5 years and then these eclipses every 15 years, because we know, okay, secondary moon as fast as tertiary sun. So the moon will do one lap in the secondaries, and then the sun will do a lap, which is a year. And we all know, just through living through the transits, in 1 year, we have 2 seasons of eclipses 6 months apart, right? So what will happen is, in the 30-year circuit of your tertiary sun, around the circuit of the zodiac, there will be 2 eclipse seasons of your life that happen 15 years apart. And they're going to occur for a period of 2 years or so each time, every 15 years. So these progressed eclipses will occur around the signs and houses of the lunar nodes in your natal chart, recurring every 15 years or so. And they'll slowly move backwards into actually the previous signs and houses, because that's how the nodes move. So everyone will have around 10 progressed tertiary eclipses, right? 2 at a time at those 15-year intervals. So if we just say, all right, 15, 30, 45, 60, and 75, that's 5 eclipse seasons you'll have for around 10 eclipses or so. Actually, if it is spaced out like that, you'd have 2 around when you're born too. So you might get 12. For longer, maybe even 14. But everyone should get 10-ish.
In a good life, sometimes,
Yes.
I always think about Bonatti, where he's like, here's this amazing Time Lord technique, and if you don't make it to the end, that just happens, and astrology is not, useful. And it's like, oh my gosh, you can't say that, guy,
Yeah. So anyway, yes, it's an average, but at the very least, every 15 years, coming around again, marking drastic shifts, new beginnings, life and career defining moments, and serious peaks and valleys in one's life that are deposited into the houses that they're happening in, that they activate. So that really brings us through the bulk of the discussion of the technique that we're going to look at. And now,
before we move on to Kepler, let's answer a few questions in the chat. Marsha's asking about whether people who are night births or of the night sect are more sensitive to tertiaries than people of the day. And I'm not sure how to answer that. I think that tertiaries are so fresh off of the mind of Troitsky that we need to see. And the other thing is that tertiaries are used a lot in mundane astrology. Troitsky was primarily a mundane astrologer and compiled a huge database of 1,001 mundane event charts. So if you think about the time scale of a secondary progression, if we're looking at the election of an administration that's only going to exist for 4 years, secondary progressions don't really help. But if we look at the tertiary progressions and it's a 4-year administration, then we can see a lot of cool things taking place, and really go deep into that. And also, if you're looking at the idea that the leader of a country or of a company is representing the entire entity, the tertiaries for that person's chart will have an effect on what they're looking at as well. So I'm not sure that sect as an ancient technique is as relevant to tertiary progression measurement and prediction, but it's a great research question. And if you want to do the research, anyone, I would love to read it. And then Diane's asking, what happens if someone has a full moon in their natal chart? And then we're looking at progressed and tertiary timescales related to that. I would say that's literally just putting you on a very easy to calculate clock, as opposed to somebody who has a moon that's maybe, 147 degrees away from the sun. It's a little bit harder to calculate, but if you're born on an exact lunation of new, full, or quarter, it's a little easier to measure when certain things will happen for you. The only warning or caution would be to make sure you know whether the planets are moving fast or slow at that time, because those shifts in motion are also important.
The only other thing I'll just add quickly to that question is like, one thing we're not addressing here is converse progressions. And what happens when you're born on an exact phase transition means that exactly forward and backward in time, it's mirroring the same phase. So
we go about that in the class. So
yeah, so you can learn more about that for your chart in particular with the converse astrology as well. Yeah, yes, we're about to get to our example nativities and preferred house system. This good old question. I'll just say one that has cusps.
Yeah, something quadrant based.
Yeah, I mean, whole sign houses will work. Placidus will work. Coke will work. Equal houses will work. But something with cusps is nice because you will notice when, there's something on a house cusp. It's not just on an ingress into a sign or a new whole sign house, but things trigger cusps really impactfully. So not observing those can lose a little bit of detail. So anything with a cusp, I would say. But
yeah, and I would recommend maybe looking at the Koch house system, which was developed in the same timing as this, likely in concert with the way that Koch responds to mundane astrology in specific. But if you have a relationship with the house system, I feel it's kind of like a magical conversation. And so if you already are used to looking at things through that, the astrology will say, yeah, it works for you. And at some point it'll break and you'll pick a new house system. You have to repair your house system, I guess. But it's sort of like, don't just change the house system willy-nilly. If you already are very strong with one, try the technique out with that one. And if it is breaking for you, then move on to another one and try that one out. But I don't think that there's any perfect house system. I think that are all valid. And so you just use the one that seems to work the best for you. Not that everything's equivalent, but certain house systems work better for certain techniques. And I think that, like Cam is saying, the quadrant-based systems work really well with this.
Yep. Perfect. So yeah,
let's look at Kepler.
Yeah, so this was actually pretty exciting here, actually, to see Kepler's chart working with the tertiary progressions so loudly. We were just like, how can we not talk about this nativity? So this is just a glimpse at Kepler's birth chart, which you can all take a look at here. A few notes. So this is actually displayed with Placidus house cusps, since it's the house system that I was using to calculate the cusps. I use Placidus cusps. I think they're great. And these are also on the sidereal zodiac, which for our purposes won't really be super important because we're looking at the movement of the phases of the moon, basically to the sun. So that's regardless of any zodiac. But if you're curious, this is using, the sidereal zodiac here. So when he was really young, he was just about 5 years old. And there was a great comet of 1577 that happened that he observed when he was just a young kid. And in the month that this was happening, he had a tertiary progressed new moon in Pisces. So this chart down here on the bottom left gives all the data that we're kind of looking at in the chart. So what we see on the right is his nativity on the inside, and then the tertiary progressed placements outside of that. And on the bottom left-hand corner of the table here, we have his birth chart information, and then the tertiary progressed date, so when it's actually happening in his life. And then beneath that, it says transit/progressed date. So what it's actually showing is the positions of the planet on 24th of March, 1572, which is just a couple of days after he was born, since we're, again, moving from month to days. This was calculated through AstroSeek's website. It allows you to calculate tertiary progressions and add the bija correction, which you can also see on the bottom there, which again, I really recommend for doing predictive work. So yeah, this new moon happened basically right as he was observing this comet. And this happened in his 10th house. And so it began this opening up of his observation of the sky, seeing this great celestial phenomenon. And, you can see that the new moon was also conjunct Jupiter in the fish. So this was happening in front of this, really great moment for him personally, where he felt totally re-energized emotionally, right? There's this new wave of Piscean emotion washing over him in his house of, career and reputation. It's also squaring his natal Mercury within a couple degrees, which rules his own MC by bound, and it rules his ascendant, and also his rising bound. So Mercury is playing a key role into linking himself with his career through this square of the new moon to his natal Mercury. In the winter of 1589 to 90, he began his first year attending Tübingen University. He was studying philosophy and theology and was becoming kind of a renowned astrologer. He was calculating horoscopes for his friends and everything. And what happened here through that winter was a tertiary progressed full moon in Aquarius in his natal 9th house. So it went exact around early January of 1590. And it's exactly happened at one of the 7 sacred degrees, which is right where the flow of the water pour of Aquarius intersects the ecliptic. So his moon was passing through this sacred region of wisdom and divine knowledge, which was in his 9th house, which is the house of higher education, theology, philosophy, everything he was studying and going out to do. So we can really see here through that full moon how he was illuminated in his studies and what he was doing. Now, a few years after that, in the summer and autumn of 1596, he began writing and developing his Mysterium Cosmographicum, which was this theory of the universe in the divine proportions of the 5 Platonic solids and his astrological theory behind the cosmos. It was published just a little bit later this year, or that year. And this was the full moon that followed the previous. And this one is actually not only a tertiary lunar return for him, but it's a tertiary full lunar return because we see that it's opposite the sun in Scorpio. So again, it's another full moon and it's his lunar return. And he's just manifesting and creating this whole work of knowledge and wisdom. And it's with Aldebaran, the Eye of the Bull, which is a star that has to do with the manifestation of the material world. And, he's illuminating how things are made and how the universe is structured in the cosmos. Now, on New Year's Day in 1600, Kepler ventured to Prague to work with Tycho Brahe and begin sort of collaborating at his new observatory, which was being built. And what happened just like within a few days, he had a tertiary progressed solar eclipse in Capricorn. And this actually happened at 5 Capricorn, which is right with Altair, the eagle's eye, that soaring wisdom and vision that just brought him to a whole new expanse of visionary discoveries and observation of the heavens, So this happened just within days of him going to Prague. And this actually played out in a really important way because it initiated a whole plus 1 decade long period of his life working in Prague as an astrological advisor to the emperor. So we can see how the solar eclipse happened literally within days of him going to Prague and beginning what became, this really fruitful time in his life. Yes, I was going to say, I'm actually going to jump back. One slide was skipped over. So pardon me, jumping back here.
Are you going converse, Cam?
Yes.
Not technically, but just.
Yes. Yeah. So when he was 22, so this is in between him starting at Tübingen University and writing the Mysterium Cosmographicum. In between, there was one important event I want to highlight here. He assumed actually the position at just age 22 of teaching mathematics and astronomy in Groff at the Protestant school. And this happened basically, so he had the full moon in Aquarius, which is when he started studying. 2 full moons later, which is about 5 years, the full moon was full in the Ram, in Aries, which is his natal 11th house, where his tertiary Jupiter was at that time as well. And so he was now patronized and paid to be teaching at a very young age. And we can see how, again, he reached this full moon and enters this new position in his community as a leader and a teacher and an illuminator. And yeah, so this was another critical full moon for him. Then the next full moon was in the Bull, which happened when he was producing the Mysterium Cosmographicum. And then, yeah, several years later, then we moved from just having full moons and new moons because the sun made its way to a node, which means, whoa, watch out, you're entering progressed eclipse territory, which was huge because then he had this total solar eclipse, moved to Prague, began this new chapter of life. And then in October of the following year, in 1601, after he had been working with Tycho Brahe for a little while, Tycho Brahe suddenly died. And so he was suddenly promoted to becoming the imperial mathematician, which began exactly this period of his life that was spent in this, elevated position. And what actually at the exact time it happened, he was having his moon opposition, as you can see here. But what we really are looking at is that new moon that followed just a few months later. And so here's on the next slide, the chart for that new moon, which followed in the spring of 1602. This new moon happened right on his natal MC in Aquarius. And so this really began that period of, wow, look at him and his work. He's literally assumed the position of one of the most select jobs for people that are astrologers or mathematicians or astronomers across all of Europe. And we see again with that tertiary new moon just hitting his MC right on time. That spring, he began this new and expanded role. So these were just some examples of some moons, some eclipses in Kepler's chart and throughout his life. Yeah, I hope was illustrative to see just some examples of how those new and full moons and eclipses highlight those important changes and developments in someone's career. And I hope it was also interesting to see or learn about Kepler for anyone who doesn't know about his life or biography or seen his chart. Yeah, this was just some more exciting, awesome information about the person that left the legacy that we're all continuing now here through the amazing work of KeplerCollege. So thank you.
Yeah. Are there questions?
There's a few questions. Rita is asking if it's mean or true. I don't know if she means nodes. I'm thinking, I don't know if Rita, if you want to jump on and give us more information, but you guys could speak to that.
Yeah, mean or true nodes. I think like the timing thing I said, it's like a corridor, it can kind of have a range of degrees. I personally use the true node. But what's most important is being able to calculate when the eclipses actually happen, so that's most important in my eyes here.
Okay. You were earlier talking about the Aquarius, the water bearer, and the question is that sacred position at Aquarius 19 degrees specifically?
Yes, it is. So that comes from Antiochus of Athens, who transmitted a list of 7 sacred degrees of the zodiac that are connected to special royal or divine fixed stars. And that, yeah, is one of them where the water flow kind of intersects the ecliptic.
Going back to Kepler's chart, do you know historically if Kepler had run-ins with the church of that time?
Yes, he did. So actually in the summer of 1601, so right after he went to Prague in the winter, that summer, he was refusing to convert to Catholicism. So he was actually banished from Graz, where he was living at that time, and moved permanently with his family to Prague. So that's also an element that we can actually see a little bit in which which chart is it here? Yeah, I mean, with this this new moon happening in his 8th house, right? Mars is in his 10th. We can see there's different elements here that are kind of purporting a storyline about troubles with with authority, or even Mars being seen as, in the whole sign 9th house here. That could be about problems with religious figures, or however you want to see that. But yeah, he was facing some adversity with the church at that time.
And the other thing, that if you're interested in that topic, if you haven't heard about it, there's a book called The Sun in the Church by a scholar named John L. Heilbronn. I can type the name in the chat in just a second. And it is that time where they were trying to use churches as astronomical observatories to fix the date of Easter so that all of the European continent would celebrate Easter on the same Sunday. And they actually created holes in the church buildings so that they could track the movement of the sun and calculate their tables more accurately, which led to a more accurate astronomy. So there was a lot of amazing astronomy in the church, if you can believe that. Not astrology per se, but yeah, that's something that was concomitant with Kepler's work. And it is a true progression, to re-answer the question. I know I typed it in there, but you're going to want to use the true calculation. And the other thing, if you read about the Astrology of Death, this out-of-print book, Richard Hauck talks about tertiaries as a way to rectify birth times, because a 1-week error in the occurrence of an event is roughly equivalent to a 1-minute calculation inside the tertiary, or a minute of birth time. But you can use tertiary progressions to see when things are supposed to happen and when they actually did happen, especially with hindsight's 2020, to sort of wobble your chart back into its rectified shape. So that's another thing you can add in addition to, I know that there's a cheat sheet with perfections, right? Where you can be like, hey, if I'm Capricorn rising versus Aquarius rising, but this is another way you can use tertiary progressions to rectify things, because and Jeanette's saying in the comments, huge for rectification. It's absolutely true. And if you're not a rectification nut, if you get into tertiaries, you will be. It's like a very, very slippery slope. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you, I know you have some great books that are rare or out of print, and you have the Kaylee library. So we have some advanced astrologers in our audience. If they want to get a look at some of these books, how does that work with Kaylee? Can they check them out?
We don't have a lending program yet because we don't have the staff or support for it, but if the community rallies, we could eventually develop that kind of thing. At the moment, there's non-circulation, because if you're coming here from Texas or from the UK and you've made all of this way to get here, I want everything in the building so that you can see all of it. And Cam even was here visiting, doing research, and went all around the room and just took everything off the shelf having to do with any kind of direction or progression. And the table was filled with books. And that wouldn't have been possible if half of them had been checked out. So right now you can think of it more as a research archive that you visit from afar. And if you need something from afar as a member, we can create a digital copy for your use, but we can only provide that to membership. So
got it. So people could get a look at some of those books digitally if they're a member.
Yeah, and we always do a copyright check, because sometimes with the more modernly published things, we don't have the rights to distribute, and technically making a digital copy and sending it to you is distribution. So we always have to make sure that we're not violating the law, but within the scope of the law, we can let you see digital articles and parts of books, etc. So
got it.
Yeah. And then there's the table. So Andrew Watt was talking about the 55 times 12 plus the Bija correction. And there is actually a table in the back of Astrology for Everybody. I love these old books, by the way, so I'm just going to show up some stuff. And in the very, very back, he translated Troinsky's table into English. So you can see, well, if the camera focuses, you can see this like calculation. And it's basically showing you the year table for how many years you're old, and then the day table so that you can see, okay, well, the first day of the year is obviously day 1. November 1st is the 305th day, and you can do it with math. So in the class we're going to be using this table and an ephemeris, and you're going to be doing stuff on paper without the luxury of a computer, because if that EMP hits, you still want to do your terts, okay? Like we need to be able to do some of this stuff by hand. And it's not that hard. It's simple arithmetic. It's actually really cool. So, but this table is also in the German, and the cool thing about German and English is they both use the same numbers. So you don't have to worry about that. So anyway, it's actually quite, once you get the math wrapped around your mind, especially like with doing charts by hand and you learn the logarithms, it's actually quite cool to see how you can do your tertiaries in your mind and be like, oh yeah, right now I'm in like, 1980 whatever, because I was born in 1970 whatever. The other thing that's interesting about this that Cam hasn't spoken about yet, and maybe because we're just focusing on the moon here, but I love something called deep time twins. And if you think that, you go to school in a cohort of people around your age, but not on your birthday, and sometimes you're dating someone who's maybe 2 years younger than you or something like that. And then you realize, oh my gosh, my tertiary progressed chart is this person's natal chart. And then you guys have a relationship for a minute and then it might break up and then it comes back in and you're like, oh my God. So I think that it really makes dentistry cool because I've even encountered too, someone's converse progressed synastry was the same natal chart as the actual natal chart, and then but in the other direction, like they were meeting each other at the crossover point where their progressed charts were the same, if you can believe that. Anyway, so this stuff gets really cool.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a few questions about software. Ironically, we're talking about the class learning how to do it without software, but let's go to the questions. There's a choice in Solar Fire to, let's see, calculate tertiary progressions using mean or true. And I think you were saying true is the one to choose.
Yeah, so it's the mean lunar motion versus the actual lunar motion. So just like with solar arcs, if you have someone born in the Cancer or Leo season, their sun is quite slow. And so if you try to apply solar arcs using the mean motion of the sun, it's not really going to do much for your accuracy because the sun is not moving at that rate. If someone's born in the Capricorn Aquarius season, then that sun is quite quick and things will happen years before someone in the Cancer season. So it's not just a degree equals a day, it's also what's the actual true speed of the sun in that way. And that's an analogy to place on the moon's motion, right? Like what is the actual motion of this moon? We're at a lunar standstill year. The moon is moving very differently than usual. So people born right now will have very different tertiaries as a true tertiary versus a mean one. Is that right, Cam?
Yeah, I believe so. I know there's lots of different like slight adjustments with how the programs are calculating tertiary progressions. But you can't go wrong as long as you're making sure that when you calculate it, you're making one sidereal lunar return equal one sidereal day.
Okay. How difficult is it to pull these out of Solar Fire? Is that something that you could walk through quickly, or is that more something for the class?
Jen, you have Solar Fire.
I use Solar Fire as a default because I started learning astrology in the 90s and I can't shake it. It's like one of those things. But you can use it on AstroSeek. And I know that if you have Astro Gold, you can calculate tertiaries there.
Yeah, and
But really it's
Astro.com.
anything. Yeah. Astro.com would do it. I'm partial to Solar Fire just because I'm a dinosaur like that. But any way you get there is great, and learning how to do it from scratch is cool too, because then you learn how to use the ephemeris and read it. And reading the ephemeris is like the coolest thing in the world. So, and like Jeanette's saying in the comments here with like, you see a T-square coming up, like look at the trend that's happening in the ephemeris after you were born. And then take out just this simple analog table. You can do this without a computer or a phone nearby. And you can be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have a T-square in my terts when I'm, 47. Oh my God, what's it going to be? It's kind of cool. So I think that it's really neat to be able to learn how to read these things without necessarily having software because it is easier than you think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I know, like, I think AstroSeek can animate it nicely. You can kind of step through different chunks of time to watch it reanimate the biwheel. Astro Gold also does an animation for tertiaries. I think Solar Fire might just be calculating standalone charts. But Solar Fire can also do converse tertiary progressions, which I think is the only program that's doing that.
It can have, you
Maybe
can actually
Sirius and
do,
Janus also have it, but I'm not sure.
you can progress by any fraction in Solar
Yeah.
Fire. You set your number and then it does it. Because there's also somebody who does it by like 0.5. So instead of 1 degree, it's like 0.5 or 0.29, I think. I mean, I've been reading a lot of different things in here. It gets kind of chaotic. But to
Yeah.
answer Andrea's question in the comments here in the questions, how do you find the eclipses? Where are your nodes? And remember, nodes slowly retrograde backwards as time moves forwards. And so where you have nodes, as your tertiary moon, it moves, you know, as you get to find your tertiary moon from your lunar position to the node and the sun, like you're going to find where those eclipses will be in time. And then that, so for example, if you have your nodal axis at Taurus, Scorpio, then when your tertiary lunations go around there, wherever you were born, if you were born then, they'll find it, right? And so that's how you find them, just using your mind. You don't have to actually look into software for that. And then, yeah.
Okay. Michael asks, are lunations by tertiary progression the most practical thing to look for, or can you consider other measurements like planet to angle?
Angles are actually the most critical. Today we focused on the moon because it's digestible and simple, but there's so much more. That's why we're teaching a whole class about it. And there's a lot of different ways. I love the Mars-Saturn midpoint, Mars-Saturn contacts for health crisis. There's a lot of ways that you can think about prominent angular planets in your chart, the planet that rules your ascendant and what it's doing in the tertiaries. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can get value out of those.
Yeah. I personally really like emphasizing all the planetary phases. So just progressed retrograde cycles of planets through the houses is like super easy and it works so well. Like when you have a tertiary Mars retrograde, you know, it's going to happen for like 6 or 8 years, you know, and it's just going to go through one house. So those other planetary cycles are really key. Mercury, Venus especially too. But we just did the moon to kind of make that understandable and easy, but everything goes. Literally everything goes. And you can even read the tertiary chart as a standalone. This is something not everyone agrees about, but I personally, I can use that chart on its own and just look at how the current ascendant with the way you're calculating the tertiary angles, which is kind of a whole other discussion. You can just read that chart on its own and it's going to describe things correctly without actually rooting to the nativity. That helps, but
Yep.
it can be done alone too.
I know that's something Chloe wanted to hear. So there's that.
Oh, okay.
You're on the right track, Chloe. And then if you have, so Diane's asking a question about if you have a natal T-square and you go through one in a tertiary chart, that's called a holographic transit and they're awesome. And that's a totally different class. But anytime you have anything in the forward motion, whether it's directed, progressed, transiting, that matches something that's resonant by arc distance in your natal chart, you will feel it. And sometimes it feels really good and sometimes it feels really hard, but it will be for you because as CEO Carter said, nothing can come to pass that isn't promised in the natal. And so when these recurrences happen, that's your time. That's your move to make in life and make an impact in the world or have the world impact on you. That's where the narrative actually is. And so it's very important to look at. Yes, and holographic transits, Marcia, is getting republished again by the end of this year. I was typesetting it last night. So,
Great.
yeah.
Question from Melissa. Would you recommend using the BHA calculation with all progressions, including secondary?
Yes, absolutely. Especially the faster the progression, because what happens on the secondary level is, like I said, after 50 years, that hit date for your secondary progressed new moon might be 50 days off. But in tertiary progressions, that bija correction is going to add up 12 times faster. So it's going to keep your tertiaries really honed in way longer. You're going to notice a disparity if you're not adding that correction. It will be close, but you'll notice consistently things are getting slowly out of whack. But that bija correction keeps things moving on just right.
We have made it through all of our questions. Unless anyone has a burning question that you pop in real quick, we're going to be wrapping up today. So I will also invite you to ask questions about the course because Cam and Jen are going to cover this in the course, plus all those other planets and angles and let you practice doing this. So if you have any questions, please pop that in the Q&A.
Oh, Andrea's got a question. So this table, I was hoping we could have slipped it into the slide deck before going live, but it didn't happen, and that's all good. You have to come to class now. No, it's this in the back, Andrea, there is a math table that does tell you how to correct for that, and it is this little column here that gives you the addition of what that's supposed to be. So that, you know, if you're, and then when you look at the, like, pages where they describe how to do this, it simply looks like a math worksheet. But this is the information that you would need in order to complete that without necessarily having a crazy scientific calculator. So it's as simple as just counting the ephemeris.
Yeah, there is a quick math trick to know. So if you're familiar with the 19-year Metonic cycle, the amazing way the ancients used their calendars was that every 19 years, we have 12 years of 12 months and 7 years of 13 months. So every 19 years, you can add an extra 7 months, basically, and that will keep that math quicker, again, more aligned without actually like going through and counting how many lunar returns you've had. Every 19 years, just add 7 months. Because of the way that the intercalation used to work, it actually works out really neatly that that's just 12 and 7, which is also nice for those numerological reasons, astrologically, in the 19-year cycle.
Yeah. So the required text will be the new edition of Blaschke's Progressions, because this is now out of print, and that will be in print by the time class starts on the 7th of July. I was working on it last night. And we also are going to be giving you materials from Kaylee compiled into a reader. So you don't actually have to buy anything. It's a gift from Kaylee to you to get you caught up on the latest research in tertiaries from the 20th century. A lot of these books are kind of unobtainable. So we're putting together a reader for you. So that'll be as PDF form that you can have when you're in the class. And there was another question about class here. How many people? It's limited to 35, but I think at this point we have 10. And so there's space. Please come.
Okay, and then we have a question about relocation charts in this process.
Do it.
Yeah, that's the mapping certificate. That's
Yeah.
We're in timing. Mapping's another one.
Yeah.
I mean,
of course.
In mapping, we would probably say use your natal chart, but again, it's one of those things that not all astrologers agree on. So it's your choice, and you should, Jen would probably say this, try it out and do some research on it.
Yeah.
So this is the book that we're going to give you excerpts from the PDF, and this is the old progressions book. If you have it, great. You can use it. You don't need a new copy. If you don't have it, the new one will be available as class begins. Dynamic astrology, yes, we're on case of that. It was part of our oh, thank you, Marcia. Yeah, it was part of our preparation for this. I love that dynamic astrology book. Best font cover ever. I mean, I swear.
Spence's book is great. It's like a whole book just on tertiaries.
Totally. Yeah. So what year is the astrology for everyone? Let me ask the librarian at Kaylee. 1960. So yeah. No, I would love to mix relocated with all kinds of progression techniques to see, like, when are you actually going to move to the thing and when do you got to leave? You know, there's a whole kinds of.
Yeah. We actually have two courses this summer with astrocartography, and there's also one with local space, which is also interesting. So if you're really interested in asking the teachers about that, check out one of those courses. And next weekend, our free webinar next weekend is on astrocartography. So come back and ask that question.
Yeah.
When and Cindy are here.
Yeah.
That's going to be great. Yeah, no, do definitely be in touch about that. I would love to hear it because I love a relocated chart. So
yeah, relocated progressed for sure. I haven't experimented it a ton with tertiaries, but I know it's clicking in my chart at least. And I know Blaschke writes about it. He did it a ton. But yeah, I think it's also tough because that question of relocating the angles also plays into the question of how you progress the angles. And there's different ways to do that. So that's, again, a whole other question for studying the nitty-gritty of progressional techniques.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is someone asked one other thing here. I'm sorry. I was going to answer a question.
Can you just scan the ephemeris or count the days as months, divide by 12, or do you need the correction?
You do need the correction. Yeah, it's not as you'll be a little bit off.
Add 7 basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
Forward to
thanks for
seeing you in class.
Yeah. Yeah, this has been
Alrighty.
super fun.
Thank you so much, Cameron and Jen. This was really wonderful, and it's a subject that I don't think gets talked about very often. So really happy that you could be here and share this with our audience. And of course, if you want to go deeper, please take the course with Jen and Cameron. It's a 5-week course, and you'll get to practice this. And you'll also, these are live classes, so it's an opportunity to be able to talk to the two of these two instructors face to face and in forums and learn with some of your peers. So hopefully we'll see you in class. And thank you, Mary, for supporting in the chat box.
Yes. Thanks, Mary.
Yeah.
Oh, I remember someone asked if it's an advanced class. I would say, you know what? Probably yes, but it's fun and challenge yourself. Just jump in the deep end because that's where the best stuff happens. So even if it is maybe a little bit over your head, I would say after 5 weeks with Cam and me, you're going to be swimming and it'll be super great. So
Yeah.
All righty. Well, thanks again. Hopefully we'll see you next week in our next webinar or in a class at Kepler College. Thank you so much for being here. We'll see you next time.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
thank you. Bye.